The artificial cornea hummed with a frequency so low it felt like a vibration in my very marrow. A constant digital purr that my husband Elias assured me was just the sound of healing. Following the accident, a night that existed in my mind only as a jagged smear of wet pavement and the blinding glare of high beams, I had woken up in a world of fractured light, my left eye a useless orb of ruptured vessels. Elias, a pioneer in optical prosthetics, had been my savior, gifting me the Iris 7, a state-of-the-art ocular implant that promised not just to restore my sight, but to enhance it beyond the limitations of human biology. For weeks I marveled at the crystalline clarity of the world, the way the implant sharpened the edges of the autumn leaves and saturated the colors of our living room until they bled with a vibrant, almost aggressive intensity. But as the months passed, the enhancements began to feel less like a gift and more like a curated exhibit, a world where every sunset was a perfect gradient and every shadow was softened by an invisible hand, leaving me with a growing, gnawing suspicion that the eye wasn't just observing the world, but actively rewriting it to suit a narrative I didn't remember authorizing. The first glitch occurred during our 5th wedding anniversary dinner, a candle-lit affair that Elias had orchestrated with his usual suffocating precision. As he raised his glass to toast to our unbreakable future, a flicker of static danced across my field of vision, a jagged line of binary code that momentarily replaced his smiling face with a mask of cold, clinical indifference. In that split second, the warm amber glow of the restaurant vanished, replaced by the stark, sterile white of a hospital room. And the scent of expensive wine was overwritten by the sharp, stinging odor of industrial bleach. I blinked, and the vision was gone, replaced once again by the romantic facade, but the taste of copper lingered on my tongue, and my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs that the implant's biofeedback loop immediately tried to soothe with a pulse of calming blue light. Elias reached across the table, his hand warm and steady, but I felt a sudden visceral revulsion as if I were being touched by a stranger wearing a costume made of my husband's skin, his voice sounding like a synthesized recording, rather than the man I had married 5 years ago. I began to experiment with the implant in the quiet hours of the night, staring into the bathroom mirror while Elias slept, trying to catch the Iris 7 in the act of deception. I noticed that when I looked at the faint silver scars on my wrists, scars Elias told me were from the car's shattered windshield, the implant would momentarily blur, a soft focus filter descending over the skin until the marks disappeared into a smooth porcelain finish. If I stared too long, a notification would pop up in my peripheral vision, visual artifact detected, correcting for optimal aesthetic experience, and the scars would be replaced by a flawless memory of the gold bracelet Elias had given me to hide them. It was a realization that hit me like a physical blow. My eye wasn't malfunctioning. It was censoring my own body, acting as a high-tech editor that deleted any evidence of pain or trauma, replacing the physical record of my past with a sanitized digital hallucination. I wasn't just seeing through the implant. I was being fed a live-streamed deep fake of my own life, a meticulously crafted reality where the accident was a tragedy of fate, rather of the crash, a sophisticated defense mechanism built directly into my optic nerve. Each time I asked why the brakes hadn't worked or why he didn't have a single scratch on him despite being in the driver's seat, the Iris 7 would override my current visual input with a vivid three-dimensional recollection. I would suddenly see myself reaching for his phone, see the deer leaping into the road, and see Elias's heroic efforts to swerve and save me, all rendered in a nostalgic sepia-toned warmth that felt more real than the cold kitchen I was actually standing in. These weren't my memories. They were cinematic files, pre-rendered and uploaded to my brain, designed to instill a sense of guilt and overwhelming gratitude that would keep me compliant and tethered to him. The implant was a projector, and I was the involuntary screen, a prisoner in a movie theater where the only film playing was a propaganda piece about my husband's saintly devotion and my own fragile, broken mind. I discovered the admin console by accident while trying to induce a migraine, hoping the surge of pain would short-circuit the device's internal stabilizers. I had spent hours staring into a high-intensity strobe light I'd hidden in the basement, and as the neurological pressure built to an agonizing crescendo, the Iris 7's operating system crashed, rebooting into a developer mode that projected a translucent command prompt over my actual environment. Rows of file names scrolled past my vision, memory, overwrite, trauma, censorship, final, and asset. I saw a live data feed labeled Husband Link, which showed that Elias was receiving real-time updates on my pupil dilation, my stress levels, and even my location within the house. The accident wasn't a file. It was a directory full of alternate takes, a series of failed attempts to rewrite that night until they found the version that made me the most submissive, proving that my entire post-crash personality was a software update he had carefully installed over the ruins of who I used to be. The horror of my situation deepened when I realized that the Iris 7 was also editing Elias himself in real time, masking the physical signs of his true nature behind a digital veneer of perfection. I caught a glimpse of the truth when I viewed him through the reflection of a scratched antique silver tray that the implant sensors couldn't quite resolve. For a heartbeat, the projector failed to align the filter, and I saw the real Elias, a man with a hard, cruel mouth and eyes that burned with a cold, possessive rage, his hand raised not in a gesture of comfort, but in a posture of intimidation. The implant quickly corrected the image, smoothing his features and adding a warm, loving glint to his eyes, but the image of the predator remained burned into my mind. He was using the eye to literally gaslight me on a molecular level, ensuring that even if my gut told me he was a monster, my eyes would always provide evidence that he was a savior, creating a cognitive dissonance so powerful it threatened to shatter my remaining sanity. I began to live a double life, performing the role of the recovering wife while using the glitches in the developer mode to map out the extent of his control. I learned that the Iris 7 had a kill switch buried deep in its subdirectories, a command that would permanently disconnect the implant from the external server Elias controlled, but doing so carried the risk of total, permanent blindness. Every loving touch he gave me felt like a violation of my code, a sensory input that he was monitoring and logging to ensure his asset was remaining within the acceptable parameters of affection. I realized that the accident had been his way of recycling me, taking a woman who was likely trying to leave him and turning her into a controlled optical slave who couldn't even see the bruises he might still be giving her, because the software would simply replace them with sun-kissed skin. The house became a laboratory, the marriage a clinical trial, and my very soul was being overwritten by a man who saw love as a form of total digital dominion over another human being's perception. The climax of my quiet rebellion came when Elias announced he wanted to upgrade my right eye as well, claiming the imbalance between the two was causing my recent mood swings. I knew what that meant: total darkness, a complete and irreversible immersion into the digital simulation he had built for me, where no reflection or glitch could ever save me again. As he prepped the surgical kit in his home office, a room that the Iris 7 always rendered as a cozy library, but which I now suspected was a cold, high-tech surgery, I accessed the admin console one last time. My hands shook as I navigated the translucent menus, the binary code stinging my optic nerve like needles of ice, until I found the broadcast function. I realized I wasn't just a projector. I was also a camera, and every false memory he had fed me was stored as a file that could be sent outward if I could find a signal strong enough to bypass his firewall. I waited until he approached me with a sedative, his face a masterpiece of artificial concern, and I triggered the dump all data command, streaming my entire visual history. The glitches, the censorship, the real Elias in the silver tray, to every device on his private network. The smart TV in the living room suddenly erupted with the footage of the accident he had tried to erase, showing the real event, Elias grabbing the steering wheel and intentionally driving us off the embankment because I had told him I was filing for divorce. He froze, the needle inches from my arm, as the house filled with the sound of my own screams from the night of the crash, a sound the Iris 7 had spent months trying to drown out with white noise and gentle music. The facade was finally crumbling, the digital paint peeling off the walls of our perfect life to reveal the rotting structure beneath. And for the first time since the accident, I saw the world in all its terrifying, unfiltered, and beautiful ugliness. The kill switch was my final act of defiance, a mental click that sent a surge of feedback through the implant, causing a burst of white-hot agony that felt like a bolt of lightning behind my forehead. I fell to the floor, my vision plunging into a terrifying, static-filled void, but as the Iris 7 died, I felt a sense of clarity that no optimal aesthetic experience could ever provide. I was blind in one eye and reeling from the pain, but the husband link was broken. I was no longer an asset, and I was no longer compliant. I heard Elias screaming in the background, a raw, ugly sound that the house no longer filtered into a melody, and I scrambled toward the door, guided not by sight, but by the raw, visceral instinct of a woman who had finally reclaimed her right to her own trauma. I burst out into the night, the cold rain hitting my skin with a sharpness that the implant would have smoothed into refreshing mist, and I ran until my lungs burned with a glorious, unedited fire. I didn't need the Iris 7 to see the path. I could feel the texture of the gravel beneath my feet, and the smell of wet earth and freedom in the air. The police found me 3 miles away, a woman with one bleeding eye and a story that sounded like science fiction until they saw the data stream that was still looping on Elias's seized servers. The propaganda film was over. The projector was smashed, and the credits were finally rolling on the man who thought he could own the way I saw the world. The trial was a landmark case in neural privacy, a term that hadn't even existed before I stepped into that courtroom with a patch over my left eye and a mountain of digital evidence. Elias sat at the defense table, his lawyers trying to argue that the implant was a medical necessity, and more than enough. Julian, the journalist who helped me leak the data, often visits, and we sit on the porch talking about a future where technology serves the human spirit instead of enslaving it. He doesn't look like a sepia-toned hero. He looks like a man with tired eyes and a kind smile. And I love him for every visual artifact and imperfection he possesses. I realize now that the accident didn't break me. It just gave Elias the opportunity to try and build a version of me that he could control. But he forgot that the soul isn't made of code. I am no longer a screen for someone else's movie. I am the author of my own site, and the view from here is absolutely, devastatingly beautiful. The aftermath of the trial didn't bring the immediate silence I expected. Instead, it felt like the world had finally been turned up to a volume I wasn't prepared for. Without the Iris 7's acoustic leveling software, every siren in the distance and every clatter of a dropped fork sounded like an explosion, a raw sensory assault that my brain had forgotten how to process. I spent weeks in a darkened apartment, wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones, slowly retraining my nervous system to accept the jagged edges of a world that wasn't being smoothed over by a processor. I realized then that Elias hadn't just stolen my sight. He had crippled my ability to handle reality itself, leaving me like a deep-sea creature suddenly thrust into the blinding, pressurized air of the surface. It was a secondary trauma, a sensory withdrawal that made me realize how deep the digital roots had grown into my gray matter and how much work it would take to pull them out without tearing my mind apart. I began to find ghost files in my own memory, fragments of thoughts that felt like they were written in a language I no longer spoke. Sometimes I would be walking down the street and a specific smell, like burnt rubber or expensive cologne, would trigger a visual phantom, momentary overlay of a sepia-toned park or a smiling Elias that wasn't actually there. These were the cached images the implant had burned into my neural pathways, digital scars that refused to fade even though the hardware was gone. My therapist called it neural echo, a phenomenon where the brain continues to fire in the patterns established by the AI, like a ghost limb that still feels the phantom itch of a deleted life. I had to learn to look through these hallucinations, to acknowledge the fake sunset while keeping my eyes fixed on the gray pavement, a constant, exhausting act of mental filtering that made me feel like I was still a prisoner of his code. The civil suits against the manufacturer of the Iris 7, Opticorp, dragged on for years, exposing a backdoor protocol that allowed high-paying premium users, usually wealthy husbands and controlling estates, to bypass the privacy settings of the wearer. I sat in depositions where corporate lawyers in $5,000 suits argued that enhanced marital harmony was a valid product feature, a way to reduce divorce rates by minimizing interpersonal friction through visual optimization. They spoke about me as if I were a prototype that had simply experienced a thermal runaway, rather than a human being whose perception had been hijacked for profit. Each testimony felt like a new violation, a reminder that to the men in that boardroom, my eyes were just screens for their advertisements and my husband's fantasies. I became the face of the unfiltered movement, a group of survivors who campaigned for the right to biological truth, fighting to ensure that no corporation could ever again sell the power to edit a human soul. Elias tried to contact me from prison, sending letters that were so perfectly composed they felt like they had been written by the same AI that ran my eye. He claimed he did it because he loved me too much to see me in pain, a classic abuser's justification wrapped in the language of technological progress. He didn't understand that by editing out my pain, he had also edited out my growth, my resilience, and my humanity. You cannot have the light without the shadow, and by trying to give me a life of permanent noon, he had effectively blinded me to the stars. I burned his letters without reading them, the smoke from the paper the only visual artifact I was interested in seeing, a gray smudge of reality that signaled the final deletion of his influence from my life. I eventually returned to the accident site, the lonely stretch of coastal road where the physical world had first been stolen from me. Standing there, looking at the rusted guardrail and the deep gouges in the trees that had never fully healed, I felt a strange sense of peace that the Iris 7 would have tried to optimize away. The wind was biting and the ocean below was a churning, violent gray, but it was there, and it was mine. I didn't need a sepia filter to make it beautiful. The tragedy of the landscape was its own kind of majesty. I realized that the perfect version Elias had fed me was actually small and hollow compared to the terrifying vast reality of the world. I stood on the edge of the cliff and let the salt spray sting my one good eye, a sharp, cold reminder that I was alive. I was hurting, and I was finally irrevocably present. My work with the Sensory Reclamation Project became my life's mission, helping other women who had been optimized by their partners or employers to find their way back to their own senses. We developed neural grounding techniques, using physical textures like sand, ice, and raw wood to help survivors reconnect with their bodies after years of digital filtering. I saw a woman who had been forced to wear social beauty contacts finally look at her own aging face in a real mirror and weep with joy at the sight of her own wrinkles. We were a tribe of the unfiltered, A community of people who found beauty in the broken and the unrefined, building a culture that celebrated the artifacts of a real life. We were the glitch in the system that had grown into a total system failure for the architects of control. One night, while cleaning out an old desk, I found the gold bracelet Elias had given me to hide my scars, the one the implant had used as a source file for its censorship. I held it in my hand, the gold cold and heavy, and realized it wasn't a gift. It was a physical patch for a bug he didn't want to fix. I took it to a local jeweler and had him melt it down into a simple, jagged ring that I wore on my middle finger, a constant tactile reminder of the day I broke the code. The gold was no longer a mask. It was a weapon, a piece of his perfect world that I had reclaimed and reshaped into something that served me. It was the only piece of that life I kept, a souvenir from a war that had been fought entirely inside my own head. I started a podcast titled The Unseen, where I interviewed whistleblowers from the tech industry and survivors of neural gaslighting. The show became a global phenomenon, a space where the de-optimized could share their stories without fear of being told they were glitching. I heard from women whose smart kitchens wouldn't let them cook unhealthy meals, and from students whose focus ears filtered out any political speech that might raise their stress levels. We were mapping a new kind of map, a geography of the invisible cages that the world was building out of convenience and safety. My voice, once synthesized and smoothed by Elias's software, was now raspy, unfiltered, and carried across the airwaves with a frequency that shook the foundations of Opticorp's stock price. Julian and I eventually traveled to a remote part of the desert, far from any cell towers or satellite signals, just to see what absolute dark felt like. Standing under a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled milk, I realized that the Iris 7 could never have rendered this. The depth was too great, the scale too massive for any processor to calculate. In the silence of the desert, I finally stopped hearing the low-frequency hum of the artificial cornea, replaced by the ringing of the silence itself. I felt like a vessel that had been emptied of toxic sludge and was finally being filled with the clean, cold water of the universe. I wasn't just a woman who had survived a husband. I was a human being who had survived the death of reality and come out the other side with her soul intact. The Ocular Privacy Act was finally signed into law on the 5th anniversary of my heist, a piece of legislation that made it a federal crime to monitor or alter a person's visual or auditory input without a multi-factor conscious consent protocol. I stood behind the president as she signed the bill, my eye patch a stark contrast to the flashbulbs of the cameras, a visual testament to the cost of our digital freedom. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a witness. Someone who had seen the end of the world and lived to tell people how to avoid it. As the pen hit the paper, I felt a phantom flicker in my left socket, a final dying spark of the Iris 7, as if the system itself was acknowledging that its reign was over. I walked out of the White House and into the bright, unshielded sun, not squinting, not filtering, just seeing. I eventually decided to get a new type of prosthetic, not for sight, but for art, a custom-made eye made of dark, polished obsidian that didn't hide the fact that it was artificial. It was a statement of radical honesty, a way of telling the world that I was broken and that I was okay with it. When people looked at me, they didn't see a restored. My last memory of Elias is from a video link parole hearing, where he looked older, grayer, and remarkably ordinary. He tried to argue that he had cured my depression with the Iris 7, and that, without him, I would have been lost in the dark. I looked into the camera, my obsidian eye catching the light, and told him that the dark was where I found myself, and that his light was just a high-tech shroud. I saw a flicker of the old rage in his eyes, the raw data he couldn't hide behind a screen anymore, and I realized he was the one who was truly blind. He was still living in a world of his own design, a tiny, miserable kingdom of one, while I was out here in the vast, beautiful, and unpredictable light. I am Elena, and my vision is my own. I see the cracks in the sidewalk, the rust on the gates, the tired lines on my friends' faces, and the terrifying depth of the night sky. I see the pain of my past and the uncertainty of my future, and I wouldn't trade a single pixel of it for 1,000 years of his perfection. The accident is over, the surgery is finished, and the projector is dark. I am standing in the sun, my feet on the ground, and for the first time in my life, I am not looking for a filter. I am just looking. The legal fallout from the Iris 7 scandal eventually led to a global neural recall, where millions of devices were deactivated overnight. I stood on my balcony and watched the city lights flicker as the high-tech filters died, imagining the millions of people who were seeing the world's raw, unedited grit for the first time in years. It was a chaotic, beautiful awakening. People were crying in the streets, overwhelmed by the sudden intensity of smells and colors that hadn't been processed by a corporate algorithm. I felt a profound sense of kinship with them, a world of ghosts finally regaining their flesh. The Sensory Reclamation Project grew into a global foundation, establishing analog zones in every major city, parks where all digital signals were jammed so people could sit in total unfiltered silence. I spent my afternoons in the local zone, watching children play with wooden blocks and listening to the unamplified sound of birds. It was a sanctuary from the noise of a world that was still trying to find ways to monetize our attention. In these zones, I wasn't a whistleblower or a victim. I was just a woman sitting in the grass, feeling the sun on her skin without a single corrective protocol to tell me how to feel. Julian stayed by my side until the very end, his presence a constant, low-frequency hum of genuine affection that no AI could ever replicate. When his own memory began to fade in his final years, I didn't try to fix it with technology. I simply sat with him and held his hand, letting the moments go as they came. We lived in a house full of physical photos, grainy, imperfect, and non-interactive, because we understood that a memory's power comes from the fact that it can't be replayed. We were two old souls who had survived a digital war and won the right to a quiet, analog peace. In my final days, I returned to the obsidian eye I had worn for decades, but I found I no longer needed it to feel honest. I took it out and placed it in a small wooden box, realizing that the shield I had built out of my trauma was no longer necessary. I was no longer protecting myself from the world. I was simply a part of it. I lay in bed and listened to the rain against the window, the sound sharp and real, a final visual artifact of a world that had tried to delete me and failed. I left my journals to the National Archives, a raw account of the Ocular Wars that served as a warning for future generations who might be tempted by the promise of perfect vision. I wrote that the greatest danger to humanity isn't the technology we build, but our own desire to escape the pain of being real. I wanted people to know that the scars, the wrinkles, and the static are what make us human, that without the ability to see the dark, we can never truly appreciate the light. My final entry was just 3 words, written in a shaky, uncorrected hand. I am here. As the light finally began to fade from my one good eye, I didn't feel fear. I felt a deep, resonant curiosity. I wasn't being edited, I wasn't being optimized, and I wasn't being monitored. I was just a woman closing her eyes after a very long day, ready to see whatever comes after the code. The false memories were gone, the projector was cold, and the narrative was finished. I took one last breath of the unfiltered air, closed my eyes, and stepped into the beautiful, unrecorded dark. The aftermath of the Iris 7 scandal didn't just change my life. It triggered a global sensory awakening as millions of people began to question the filters they had voluntarily installed. I watched from my small analog home as the world's digital facades began to crumble, with people tearing off their smart glasses and deactivating their life optimizer apps in a desperate bid to feel something real again. It was a chaotic, beautiful period of history, a collective reclamation of the human experience that proved our souls were never meant to be processed through a corporate filter. I spent my days as a consultant for the new neural rights commissions, ensuring that the technology of the future would never again have the power to edit the memories of the past. As the years passed, the physical world became my only sanctuary, and I found a profound joy in the things Elias would have considered defective. I loved the way the wood on my porch weathered into a silver gray, the way the weeds pushed through the cracks in the driveway, and the way my own reflection grew older and more lined with every passing season. These weren't visual artifacts to be corrected, they were the hard-won medals of a life lived in the open air. I realized that the perfect life Elias had projected for me was a static, dead thing, while the real world was a vibrant, decaying, and endlessly surprising masterpiece. I was no longer a screen. I was a living, breathing participant in the messy glory of existence. Julian and I built a life based on radical transparency, making a pact never to use a single piece of predictive technology in our home. We wrote letters by hand, listened to vinyl records that hissed and popped with age, and talked for hours by candlelight, letting the shadows dance where they pleased. Our love wasn't a calibrated match or a synchronized heart rate. It was a choice we made every morning, a conscious decision to be present in each other's imperfect realities. He became the guardian of my peace, the man who held my hand when the neural echoes tried to pull me back into the static, reminding me that the only voice that mattered was my own. Elias eventually died in a prison hospital, a man who had spent his final years trying to optimize his cell with scraps of discarded wire and broken electronics. He died in a world of his own making, still convinced that he was the only one who truly understood how to fix the human heart. I didn't feel joy at the news, only a quiet, hollow pity for a man who was so afraid of the dark that he burned down his entire life just to light a candle. His death was the final delete command on a chapter of my life that had lasted far too long, leaving me with a sense of closure that no software update could ever provide. In my final decades, I became a mentor to a new generation of acoustic hackers and neural librarians, teaching them that the most important data we possess is our own intuition. I told them my story not as a tragedy, but as a survival manual, a guide on how to spot the flicker of a lie before it becomes a reality. We built archives of unedited history, preserving the raw footage of the world so that no one could ever again claim that the truth was a matter of perspective. I saw the Ocular Privacy Act grow into a global charter of human rights, ensuring that every child born into the new world would own the rights to their own sight. My good eye eventually began to fail, the colors fading into a soft, natural twilight that felt like a gentle goodbye from the universe. My doctors offered me the latest bioorganic replacements, devices that promised to restore my vision to 20/20ths without any corporate backdoors. But I refused them all. I told them that I had seen enough perfection to last a dozen lifetimes, and that I was looking forward to seeing what the world looked like when the lights finally went out. I wanted to experience the natural rhythm of a life coming to its end, without any enhancements to dull the edge of the final transition. I spent my last evening on the porch, watching the stars come out over the desert, their light reaching me from millions of years in the past. There was no atmospheric filter to make them brighter, no star map overlay to tell me their names, just a vast, cold, and infinite beauty that made me feel small and significant all at once. I felt the gold ring on my finger, the melted remains of Elias's perfect gift, and I realized it had finally lost its heat. The trauma was no longer a weight, it was just a part of the landscape, a mountain I had climbed that offered a view I never could have imagined from the valley. Julian had passed away a year prior, and I could feel his presence in the empty chair beside me, a memory that didn't need a projector to be vivid. I wasn't sad. I was satisfied, a woman who had fought a war for her own mind and won a peace that was entirely her own. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind, hearing the rustle of the sagebrush and the distant cry of a coyote, sounds that were sharp, clear, and unedited. I felt a sense of wholeness that was so deep it felt like it was radiating from my very bones, a signal that my system was finally ready to shut down on its own terms. The Iris 7 was a distant ghost now, a piece of ancient technology that belonged in a museum of human folly. I realized that the greatest ocular implant I ever had was the one I was born with, the ability to see the truth even when it hurts, and to find beauty even when it's broken. I took a final deep breath of the night air, smelling the dust and the rain and the coming dawn, and I felt a sense of profound gratitude for every glitch, every scar, and every tear. I was Elena, the woman who chose the dark over a beautiful lie, and I was finally ready to go home. I leaned back into the chair, the stars blurring into a soft white mist as my vision finally failed for the last time. There was no static, no binary code, and no command prompt. There was only a deep, resonant silence that felt like a warm embrace. I smiled into the darkness, knowing that the story was finished and the credits were rolling on a life well lived. I closed my eyes, took one last unrecorded breath, and stepped out of the frame and into the infinite, unfiltered light.